You were never meant to know this. They tried to bury it under medical charts, family ledgers, and a century of quiet shame. But if you had stood on the banks of Troublesome Creek one autumn night in 1820, you would have seen it for yourself. A newborn's cry slicing through the stillness, its tiny body flushed, not pink, not red, but the deep, suffocating blue of a corpse. The midwife gasped. The neighbors crossed themselves. And a legend was born. The legend of the Blue people of Kentucky. For generations they said this valley was cursed, that some sin had stained the blood of its settlers, turning their children into walking omens. The locals called them marked by something older than science, older than scripture, as though the earth itself had branded them. Outsiders would not come here after dark. Children were warned never to drink from the creek. The sight of those blue faces in the moonlight was enough to freeze a grown man's heart. But the truth, like all truths worth knowing, is darker than the legend. This was no random punishment from heaven. It was something worse. It was inevitable. It was written into their bodies before they were even conceived. When a French orphan named Martin Fugate stepped into these hills and married Elizabeth Smith, their blood carried a secret, a defect so silent that neither could have known it was there. But when their children were born, the defect was revealed like ink on wet paper. 4 of their 7 children emerged marked with the unmistakable sign, skin so blue it looked as though death itself had taken residence in the cradle. To live here was to live locked away from the world, valleys so narrow you could hear a neighbor sneeze a mile away, mountains so steep the sun disappeared hours before nightfall. Roads barely cut through the ridges, and strangers were rare. This was Appalachia, before the railroads, before the highways, a place so sealed off that the blood of one generation simply folded into the next, like pages of a book pressed together. Cousins married cousins, names repeated in the census until they read like a chant: Fugate, Smith, Combs, Ritchie. Each union spun the genetic wheel again, tightening the circle until the blue became a destiny. Science would one day call it hereditary methemoglobinemia, a deficiency in the enzyme that keeps blood oxygen flowing. But in the 1800s there were no diagrams, no explanations, only fear. Imagine seeing a man splitting wood with the strength of an ox, yet his skin the color of cobalt. Imagine a girl at a baptism, her lips the shade of bruises, her hands as dark as midnight water. These were not the sick. They were the living, strong, enduring, yet their bodies carried the color of death. This is where our descent begins. The hills of Perry County still hold the memory of them. The blue people, the ones who bore their fate in every glance, every whisper, every shadowed stare. Their story is not just a curiosity of medicine. It is a story of entrapment, of bloodlines woven so tightly they could not escape their own destiny. And as we peel back the layers tonight, you will see what they carried, and why it still matters. By the time Martin and Elizabeth Fugate's children came of age, the valley had already begun to whisper. The mountains that surrounded Troublesome Creek were not just scenery. They were walls, ancient and unyielding. They didn't merely keep people out, they kept blood in. Every ridge was a gate, every stream was a boundary. If you were born here, you stayed here, not by choice, but by design older than law. There were no trains to carry you away, no smooth roads to lead you to distant towns. A trip to Hazard, the county seat, took a day on muleback through forests so dense the sun vanished before noon. Most families made the journey once or twice a year, if at all. Marriages were arranged not from preference but proximity. Neighbors became spouses, cousins became lovers, bloodlines coiled tighter with each generation, folding back upon themselves until the difference between family and stranger dissolved entirely. This was the silent machinery that sealed the Fugates' fate. The geography itself became a kind of conspirator, enforcing genetic repetition like an unspoken law. Each birth was not just a child, but another spin of the wheel. Sometimes the blue appeared, sometimes it skipped, a cruel game of inheritance that left families waiting to see which cradle would carry the mark next. The midwives stopped flinching, the neighbors stopped gasping, but the unease never left. It couldn't. Because to see that blue, that deep, cold hue staining lips and fingers, was to see something your mind told you should not exist. Life wearing the mask of death. Children who laughed, ran, played barefoot in the dust, yet looked as though they had drowned hours ago. It wasn't just unnatural, it was defiant. It broke the instinctive rules your brain uses to judge safety, health, even humanity. And yet, within the hollows, life continued as though nothing was wrong. The blue boys worked the fields, the blue girls carried water from the creek. They harvested corn, hunted squirrels, chopped wood, all with bodies as strong as any other. But when they walked into town, everything changed. Mothers pulled their children close, men looked away. Conversations died mid-sentence, even the church pews turned cold. In a place where appearance carried the weight of morality, they were living contradictions, bodies that appeared dead, yet would not die. The Fugates became a secret hidden in plain sight, tolerated yet set apart, like a haunting that everyone could see, but no one dared name. And as the years passed, the pattern tightened. The same surnames echoed through the marriage ledgers: Fugate, Combs, Ritchie, Stacy. With each closed loop of kinship, the defect grew stronger. This wasn't just heredity anymore, it was entrapment, the land itself conspiring to preserve the anomaly, locking the blue deeper into the flesh of its people. Outsiders who stumbled through the valley would later speak of them like phantoms, figures glimpsed at twilight on cabin porches, their faces shadowed and dusky in the half-light. Some called them cursed, others called them not quite human, and in a way, both were correct. Because what marked the Fugates was more than pigment, it was proof that the line between life and death is thinner than we are taught to believe, and sometimes it runs directly through the bloodstream. By the mid-19th century, the hills had finished their work. Troublesome Creek had become a closed system, not just geographically but genetically. Each ridge was a ring in a chain, each marriage another link tightening around the Fugates like iron. Court ledgers, census rolls, and family Bibles from Perry and Breathitt counties read like incantations. Fugate, Smith, Combs, Ritchie, Stacy. The same names over and over until the distinction between branches blurred. It wasn't a family tree anymore. It was a spiral, a tightening coil with no exit. Doctors call this pedigree collapse. It sounds clinical, sterile, but in reality, it is a slow kind of doom. The same ancestors appear again and again in a bloodline until their hidden traits stop being rare and become inevitable. And here in this valley, isolation turned probability into destiny. By the time a boy named Zachariah Fugate married his mother's sister's daughter, a union considered unremarkable at the time, the wheel had already spun too far to stop. The recessive gene passed silently from parent to child like a ghost no one could see until it emerged fully formed, painting the skin of newborns in the color of deep water. Understand what this meant. Their blue was not a curse that descended from outside. It was an inheritance, a seed buried inside their very cells, waiting for the moment when two carriers crossed paths. And in this valley, they always crossed paths. The mountains saw to that. The roads, or the lack of them, saw to that. The silence of their isolation saw to that. Each generation pressed the same blood closer, compressing it like coal under the weight of time, until it transformed into something rare, something unnatural, something the world was never meant to witness. Yet the Fugates themselves did not see it that way. They saw children to be raised, fields to be plowed, neighbors to be helped. Their lives followed the rhythm of Appalachian survival: plant, harvest, endure. But the world beyond the ridges saw something else entirely. Whispers grew in Hazard, the county seat, of blue babies, blue boys, blue girls, marked like omens. Merchants spoke of them in hushed voices to traveling peddlers. Preachers warned that too much blood mixing could bring down divine punishment. By the time the story leaked into the lowlands, it had already twisted into something monstrous. Outsiders spoke of blue demons, of deathkin, of children, born already halfway into the grave. That is how psychological horror works. Not with violence, but with suggestion. A face glimpsed at twilight, a shadow that doesn't match the body casting it. The Fugates were healthy, strong, long-lived, Yet their color placed them outside the category of the living in the minds of others. They became living folklore while they were still alive. People saw not who they were, but what they represented, a breach in the order of nature, proof that the human form could be rewritten by something as invisible and merciless as a gene. This is where the fear began to curdle into something deeper, contempt. Because to be visibly marked is to carry stigma like a second skin, the Fugates could not remove their difference. They could only endure it. Every trip into town meant stares that lingered too long, whispers that carried just loud enough to hear. Even in church, the blue children drew sidelong glances during baptism, as if the holy water might refuse to cling to their skin. Their color became not just a feature, but a sentence, branding them as aberrations in a culture that prized sameness as safety. And still, the bloodline tightened. Still, the blue children came. Troublesome Creek was no longer just a place. It was an engine, a closed loop of isolation and inheritance, grinding forward with cold precision, indifferent to the lives it shaped. The Fugates were not cursed. They were trapped. And as the 19th century bled into the 20th, the trap only tightened. Imagine growing up knowing that the first thing anyone would see in you was wrong. That before your name, before your voice, before your soul could even reach them, their eyes would strike your skin and flinch. That was the inheritance of the Fugate children, not just blue blood but blue perception. They were born with the color of death painted across their bodies, and foe raced to prove every day that they were alive. The hollows of Troublesome Creek offered no escape. Neighbors might grow accustomed to the sight, even indifferent, but indifference is not acceptance. It is containment. In the small schoolhouses scattered through Perry County, blue children sat on rough benches, scratching slates with chalk, while the others stole glances at their hands the color of dusk, hands that looked cold even when they were warm. They played tag in the dust outside, yet when they fell and skinned their knees, the blood that welled up was a shocking red against the bluish pallor. It reminded everyone the strangeness was not on the surface. It was inside. This knowledge cuts differently when you are the one wearing it. Oral histories speak of Fugate children who grew quiet, who walked with lowered heads, who avoided mirrors. Their families told them they were normal, and in every functional way they were. Healthy, strong, enduring. But a human mind is not built to endure constant otherness. Each glance from a stranger was a cut. Each whispered slur in hazard was a wound that would not clot. In a world where appearance defined morality, health, even worthiness of love, they were forced to exist outside the invisible boundary of the acceptable. And yet they persisted. That was the most haunting part. They worked the fields, raised livestock, tended to aging parents. They grew into adults and married, often within their own extended kin, and had children who sometimes carried the blue forward like a secret torch. Life continued, but always under observation. When a blue-skinned man walked into Hazard to buy salt or tools, conversation stopped. Mothers drew children behind their skirts. Men watched without speaking, as though witnessing something half-human, half-omen. Even doctors who prided themselves on detachment could not fully mask their unease. Psychological horror does not need monsters, it only needs difference that cannot be hidden. The Fugates were not frail, not sickly, not broken, and that was what unsettled people most. They looked like death, but lived like the living. They embodied contradiction, and the human mind recoils from contradiction. It wants categories, alive or dead, healthy or diseased, natural or unnatural. The Fugates were none of these things entirely. They stood in the crack between definitions, and for that they were feared. Inside the hollows, the fear curdled into something quieter, a kind of collective silence. Neighbors who had known the Fugates their entire lives still spoke of them in low voices when they weren't present. Some children were forbidden to play too roughly with the blue ones, as though bruises might spread like contagion. Others were warned not to marry into the family, not because of malice, but because of dread. Dread that the blue might reach through generations and stain their descendants too. That unspoken fear bled into every interaction, every glance, every pause too long. And for the Fugates, It became a prison of perception. No matter how hard they worked, how kind they were, how deeply they loved, their blue came first. It eclipsed everything. Even joy became dangerous. A wedding was a risk. Would the child be born marked? A courtship carried questions whispered behind closed doors. Do they carry it? The bloodline was both their root and their shackle, a history they could neither deny nor escape. This is the part that outsiders never understood. It wasn't the color that broke them. It was the gaze, the constant, unrelenting gaze of a world that looked at them and saw not people, but prophecy, as though their bodies carried a warning from the earth itself. That is how a human soul erodes, not from within, but from the weight of being watched as if you were never meant to exist. And still, the blue continued. By the turn of the 20th century, the blue people of Troublesome Creek had ceased to be merely neighbors. They had become folklore. In the hollows, they still worked the same fields, attended the same church gatherings, bore the same burdens of poverty as everyone else. But beyond the ridges, their story mutated. It left the narrow cabins and seeped down the dirt roads like a rumor with teeth. Merchants traveling through hazard spoke of them in whispers. Children with skin the color of bruises who walked barefoot through the dust. Men with hands like riverstone who chopped wood with unnatural strength. Peddlers carried the tale further, telling it in roadside taverns as a curiosity, a warning, a ghost story wrapped in flesh. By the time the tale reached the lowlands, it had already twisted into something monstrous, an Appalachian clan tainted by some ancient curse, a bloodline poisoned by inbreeding until even God could not cleanse it. This is how systems of perception turn into cages. Once you are made into a story, you are no longer allowed to be human. The Fugates became not Martin and Elizabeth's descendants, not farmers or miners or mothers, but the blue ones. Their very skin became a symbol, and symbols cannot defend themselves. Symbols cannot argue, or explain, or bleed. They can only endure. Even science, when it finally arrived, came not to understand them, but to claim them. Doctors from outside the valley came with needles and charts, not compassion. They called it hereditary methemoglobinemia, a rare enzyme deficiency that turned hemoglobin into a trap, locking oxygen inside the blood until the skin itself dimmed to cobalt. They spoke clinically, as though naming the mechanism erased the lives it had reshaped. But science did not see what the Fugates saw in the mirror each morning. Science did not feel the pause when a shopkeeper's smile faltered, or the way children on the road stared too long and too silently. Even in the language of medicine, they became objects. Specimens, case studies, diagrams in journals, their family trees were unspooled onto paper not as lineages of love and survival, but as genetic maps marked by the color of death. Their blood was carried away in vials to distant laboratories, their names flattened into captions. No one wrote of their laughter, or their arguments, or their quiet acts of endurance, only their anomaly. Folklore and science, two opposing forces, conspired in the same way. They stripped the Fugates of their humanity. Folklore turned them into monsters. Science turned them into data. Neither saw them as people, and when enough eyes see you as something other than human, the world begins to believe it. And so do you. Psychologically, this is annihilation. To exist only as a phenomenon is to stop existing as a person. The Fugates lived under this weight for decades. Children grew up hearing their family name spoken like a cautionary tale. Women feared that marrying outside the family might not free them, that their blood might still carry the mark no matter how far they went. Men carried their strength like armor, hoping their labor could drown out their appearance. But the blue always spoke first. It entered every room before they did. It lingered after they left. And yet, the blue endured, passed from cradle to cradle like an heirloom, surviving both gossip and analysis. The hills had created them, and the hills were still holding them. There comes a moment when repetition stops feeling like life and starts feeling like fate. For the Fugates, that moment came silently, like rot beneath the floorboards. It crept through the family line without warning, until one generation looked into the faces of the next and saw not children, but mirrors. They had done everything human beings can do to outrun stigma. They worked harder, they raised larger families, they kept their heads down and their hands busy, hoping the blue would seem smaller if they made their lives larger, but the color did not fade. It bloomed again and again, generation after generation, like some ancient signature the earth had carved into their blood. And as the years ground on, a quiet dread began to take root, a realization whispered only behind closed doors. There may be no escape from this. This was not superstition. It was arithmetic. The valley itself was a machine, grinding their bloodlines in circles. Geography made rebellion impossible. The same surnames filled the marriage registers: Fugate, Stacy, Combs, Ritchie, Smith. Each union rethreaded the same gene back into the web, tightening the loop. Even those who dreamed of leaving rarely could. The roads were long, the world suspicious, and poverty anchored them to the soil like iron shackles. To break free meant abandoning everything they knew, their families, their farms, their very sense of place, and most could not bear it. So the blue became inevitable. And inevitability is its own kind of horror. Because when you know the mark is coming, when you know it is not a question of if but when, love itself becomes dangerous. Courtship became a kind of Russian roulette. Every smile, every glance across a church pew shadowed by the question, will our children be marked? Every pregnancy carried not just hope but dread. Expectant mothers waited not only to see if their babies would live, but what color they would be when they did. This psychological weight is hard to fathom from the outside. To raise a child already knowing how the world will see them, not as innocent but as aberrant, is to walk through parenthood with a quiet grief lodged in your chest. It is to hold your newborn and love them ferociously, while silently begging their skin to stay pale. Some prayed, others simply braced themselves. And when the blue appeared, as it so often did, they smiled through their heartbreak and whispered the only lie that could keep them going. You're just like everyone else. But they weren't, and they knew it. Even the children who escaped the color could not escape its shadow. They carried it like a phantom, waiting to see if their own children would carry it next. The defect could sleep for a generation, then awaken without warning, painting the next cradle cobalt. It made their own blood feel like an enemy, silent, patient, impossible to fight. This is what breaks the mind over time. Not catastrophe, but certainty. Not pain, but inevitability. And outside the hollows, the whispers never stopped. Strangers spoke of them as if they were cursed, tainted, half alive. Those whispers seeped back into the valley like poison, until even the Fugates began to wonder if maybe, in some hidden way, it was true. This is how psychological control works, not through chains, but through belief. Convince a man he is marked, and you can trap him without touching him. The blue did not just shape their bodies, it reshaped their minds. It convinced them they were trapped. And in doing so, it made it real. The hills had hidden them for over a century, but nothing hidden stays hidden forever. By the 1960s, the roads that once ended in mud had hardened into pavement. Rail lines carved through the ridges. Outsiders, traders, doctors, journalists began slipping into the hollows like invasive roots, and with them came something far more dangerous than ridicule or whispers. Attention. It was a local nurse, Ruth Pendergrass, who first dared to break the silence. She had seen them. The men with cobalt lips, the women with twilight-colored hands, and unlike others, she did not look away. Instead, she called for help, not compassion, not refuge, science. She contacted Dr. Madison Cowan III, a hematologist from the University of Kentucky, a man trained to see only what could be measured. Cowan came armed with vials, syringes, charts, and curiosity sharpened like a blade. He traveled the narrow roads into Troublesome Creek not as a neighbor, but as an investigator, as though crossing into another world. In a sense, he was. These families had lived generations under the weight of silence, their lives so rooted in the soil that even death could not carry their names beyond the next ridge. And now, a stranger arrived to pierce that silence, with needles. One by one, he drew their blood. Blue men, blue women, blue children, all lined beneath the sterile glow of lanterns in cold little clinics, as he labeled vials and packed them in ice. He traced their family lines backward through yellowed Bibles and brittle courthouse ledgers, marking how the same names looped through each branch like a closed knot. He sketched their bloodlines like crime scenes. He recorded their faces as though they were exhibits, and perhaps they were, because to science, they had ceased being people. They had become evidence. Kaween found what the Fugates had never needed explained: a deficiency of cytochrome B5 reductase, the enzyme meant to keep hemoglobin functioning. Without it, their blood locked oxygen away like a miser, leaving the skin starved, turning it blue. Hereditary methemoglobinemia. It sounded almost elegant in Latin, like a spell, and in a way it was, a spell cast on their bodies by the blind mathematics of isolation. When Kaween published his findings in the Archives of Internal Medicine in 1964, he shattered their secrecy. The blue people became headlines, medical curiosities, journal fodder. Photographs of them circulated like artifacts from a lost tribe. Strangers came to the hollows not with offerings or respect, but with cameras. Reporters prowled their cabins. The Fugates, who had spent a century enduring whispers, now faced the blinding roar of spectacle. Understand the violence in that. These were people who had lived ordinary lives, farming, marrying, burying their dead on the same hillsides that held their ancestors. Now they were specimens, dissected in print and gossip, their faces pinned like butterflies to the bulletin board of American curiosity. The isolation that had once protected them became a glass case. Even the cure carried its own kind of horror. Kaween tested methylene blue, a chemical that could force hemoglobin back into its normal state. Within hours of injection, their lips turned pink, their skin flushed with the color the world expected to see. To outsiders, it was a miracle. To the Fugates, it was something far stranger. A glimpse of a life that had never been theirs. But the effect faded. Always. The blue returned, creeping back over their faces like twilight reclaiming the hills. In that cruel rhythm, the fading, the returning, lay a truth no journal could print. You cannot erase what has been written into the body by time itself. They had spent generations trying to be invisible, and then suddenly they couldn't disappear even if they begged to. After Kaween's study, the hills of Troublesome Creek were no longer their fortress. They were a cage with glass walls. Strangers came not to trade or to greet, but to stare. Reporters prowled the ridges like carrion birds, cameras poised as if waiting for the strange to perform. For the Fugates, this was worse than the whispers. Whispers could be survived. They were background noise, soft enough to pretend away. But attention is invasive. It enters you. It rearranges who you think you are. Imagine living your whole life as a quiet anomaly. Then seeing your own face printed in newspapers under headlines like "The Blue People of Kentucky," as though you were a sideshow, a myth dredged from the woods. Imagine children who had spent years trying to believe they were ordinary, suddenly finding themselves displayed in classrooms and laboratories as proof of something unnatural. There is a violence in being named, a finality. It tells the world what you are, and it leaves no room for what you might have been. Some Fugates fled further into the hills, refusing interviews, refusing photographs. Others submitted to the scientists because they saw no other path. Blood was drawn, samples catalogued. Their veins became property, their genealogy dissected like an autopsy. Even when they agreed, they were not participants. They were specimens. And the methylene blue, the so-called miracle, only deepened the wound. Under the fluorescent glare of clinics, doctors watched their faces flush from indigo to rose. Men who had lived 70 years, marked like omens, stared into mirrors and saw strangers staring back. Children watched their parents transform in minutes into people who no longer looked related to them. For a few hours, they were what the world had demanded they be. Then it faded. Always it faded. The blue returned like a ghost, reclaiming its rightful body. It crept back over their lips, their fingers, their faces, swallowing the borrowed color until they were once again who they had always been, and who the world had never allowed them to be. And in that cruel rhythm, the glimpse of escape, followed by the return to the mark. Something inside them broke, because the experiment had shown them what life could have been, and then proved they could never have it. That is psychological torture at its purest form. To be shown freedom, only to be locked back into your cage, They had endured centuries believing their color was simply who they were. Now they knew it was a flaw, a defect, a genetic trespass, and knowing that changed everything. You cannot unknow you are marked. You cannot unsee the bars once someone points them out. Even the children who had never shown the blue began to fear their own blood, as though a monster slept inside their marrow, waiting to wake in their sons and daughters. Love itself became dangerous. Kinship became a threat. The valley was no longer home. It was a trap with invisible teeth. And yet the world called it progress. It did not end with a cure. It ended with dilution, not a triumph of science, but of infrastructure. The very same roads and rail lines that brought the scientists also brought strangers, miners, merchants, families from distant counties who had never heard the whispers of Troublesome Creek. They married into the old valley names without knowing the weight they were carrying, and with each new bloodline that entered the hollow, the blue began to thin. Slowly, quietly, almost like guilt fading from memory, the color receded. Babies once born the hue of bruised plums began arriving pale and pink. The midwives stopped holding their breath when they saw the first cry. The whispers that had haunted baptisms, schoolhouses, and church pews dwindled. By the 1920s, doctors in Hazard noted fewer cases. By the 1940s, the blue was rare. By the 1960s, when Cowain arrived, he was chasing ghosts. To the outside world, this looked like victory. Modernity had come. The anomaly had been dissolved. Troublesome Creek could rejoin the map of normalcy. But to the Fugates, it felt like erasure, because what vanished was not only the color, it was the meaning. For generations, the blue had been their shadow, their burden, their shame, but also their identity. It had bound them together through ridicule, through isolation, through the endless weight of being watched. It had carved their names into history in a place where history rarely remembered anyone. Now, as it disappeared, it left behind nothing to hold on to. No story, no trace, just silence. Some celebrated. Others mourned quietly, though they would not say why. Imagine raising 13 children under stares, whispers, humiliation, and then living long enough to see the world forget it ever happened. Imagine carrying a mark your entire life, only for the world to decide it never mattered, that you never mattered. This is the part the headlines never printed. What vanishes from the skin does not vanish from the blood or the memory. The descendants who grew up without the color still carried the unease, the inherited fear of difference, the sense that something about them was not entirely allowed. They had escaped the appearance of strangeness, but not its shadow, and so the blue ended not with closure, but with amnesia. Troublesome Creek became just another name on a map, its legend flattened into footnotes. The Fugates scattered, married outsiders, changed their names, and the hills, once their fortress, stood silent as their story dissolved into the quiet of ordinary life. But silence is not peace, because the blood remembers what the mind tries to forget. Stand there for a moment, on the damp bank of Troublesome Creek, where the water moves slow and dark between the stones. The air here feels heavier, as if the hills themselves are holding their breath. It is quiet now. No sound but the wind through the trees. Yet if you listen closely, you can almost hear them. The voices of the blue children who once played barefoot in this dirt. Laughter echoing like ghosts. They are gone. The color is gone. The world has declared this valley normal again. But the earth remembers what it once held. For over a century, the Fugates lived marked. Not by disease, not by sin, but by inevitability. A single recessive gene had collided with isolation and geography to form a human paradox. Bodies healthy and strong, cloaked in the color of death. They were living proof that nature does not honor our categories, that the line we draw between human and other, normal and aberrant, is made of paper, and the wind of time will always tear it. And yet, we erased them. We called it progress when the railroads brought strangers who diluted the blood. We called it science when Cowain labeled their condition and extracted their lives into vials. We called it medicine when methylene blue turned their skin pink for a day, as if humanity itself were a costume they could borrow. We called it mercy when the blue disappeared. But what if it was never mercy at all? What if it was fear? Because what the Fugates represented was not a tragedy. It was a crack in the story we tell ourselves, the story that says the world is ordered, that the abnormal can be explained, corrected, erased. The blue people defied that story. They survived what should have been impossible, thrived in the face of scorn, endured in bodies that looked like omens and worked like iron. They were not broken. They were living proof that difference is not weakness, and that terrified us. So we buried them. We smoothed over their existence until only whispers remained, until they were no longer a family, but a curiosity, a headline, a footnote. We forgot their names. We forgot their lives. We forgot that they were people, but the blood never forgets. Even now, fragments of their lineage sleep quietly in the descendants who walk the modern streets of Kentucky, their skin unmarked, but their cells still carrying the silent echo of blue. A memory hidden in marrow. A ghost threaded through the double helix, waiting perhaps for silence and isolation to call it back again. This is the truth that lingers like a shadow over Troublesome Creek. They were never cursed. They were never monsters. They were never less than human. They were simply what happens when the world forgets to look, and something ancient is allowed to keep growing in the dark. So remember them. Because if there is one lesson buried in the hills of Perry County, it is this: what we bury does not die. It waits. And somewhere, in the blood of a stranger, in the quiet bones of a newborn, the blue may be waiting still. Comment, "The blood remembers" twice below to lock this knowledge inside you, and to prove you were listening when the world wanted you to forget.